Hello. Oh, that's very loud. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for making it out in this disgusting heat. Right off the top, I should mention that I'm a member of the MSCP, so is Bryan, so is Jon, and Dan is a longtime friend of the MSCP. We need to make an apology. George has come down unwell, and so you might see Bryan here instead of George Vasilakopoulos. So Bryan is going to act as some kind of provocateur this evening, but effectively it's going to be the Jon Roffe and Dan Ross show. And I just want to sort of say how grateful and pleased I am to have both Dan and Jon here. Dan, as you may know, is a sort of an eminent figure in the Stiegler scene, a translator, someone that has never actually worked in the university, as far as I'm aware, which is kind of pretty bizarre. And we have Jon Roffe, someone who also has a pretty strange relationship with university, a kind of a known Deleuzian, something that he's trying to rid himself off, like a snake shedding its skin, but which hopefully we see this evening with Jon's very interesting sounding talk. So I'm going to throw to Bryan Cooke now. And Bryan, thank you so much for subbing in like this. It's a real pleasure. So thank you very much, mate. Can we please give these people a round of applause?
Thank you so much, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here introducing the MSCP panel. The first thing I want to say, just to get out of the way, especially any of you who were here last night for the Barron Field panel, is that I am not substituting and would never presume to substitute for George Vasilakopoulos, the legendary George. I'm just here as MC. But we spoke yesterday, because I realized a number of you weren't here, about para-academia in the Barron's panel, and something that I've often said about the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy, which is that the para is deliberately ambiguous, that it's unclear whether the para means against or whether it means alongside. But the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy is, in this ambiguity, a para-academic organization, and I can think of no two better speakers to represent the school, but also the school taking on this all-important question of the conjuncture and philosophy's relation to it. Should philosophy, can it think the conjuncture? Does it have to? Is untimeliness a condition of timeliness, as Nietzsche would say? To be contemporary, as Agamben says, does that not require that one see the darkness and the light of the present? These are the kinds of questions that will be in the background of today's talk. So it's now my task to introduce formally our two speakers. Daniel Ross is the author of the excellent 2004 book, Violent Democracy. He has translated dozens of texts by the philosopher Bernard Stiegler, and he's responsible, I think, for bringing to the Anglophone world attention the idea of Bernard Stiegler through his extraordinary 2004 film, The Ister, the only film I think I can think of made by two Australians about Heidegger and Hölderlin's poem about the river, which is a term used in German for the Upper Danube, featuring Jean-Luc Nancy, Philippe Laculabart, the German filmmaker Hans Zuberberg, but at its center, this incredibly charismatic, charming figure, Bernard Stiegler. Daniel's been incredibly faithful to Stiegler's oeuvre as a translator, as the best Anglophone explicator of Stiegler's work, but he's also an original philosopher in his own right. In 2021, he published a book with the wonderful title of Psychopolitical Anaphylaxis, and despite his fidelity to Stiegler, he has this, as an original philosopher, he has an extraordinary wide-ranging work drawing on likes of Heidegger and Derrida, but also Gilbert Simondon, Peter Sloterdijk, and so forth. It's a real honor to have Daniel Ross with us today. I'd like to ask you please to make him welcome. Our second speaker, although second only in the completely arbitrary order of my introduction, who will actually be our first speaker, is Dr. Jon Roffe. Dr. Roffe has the unfortunate situation of having, in the last 20 years, been introduced by me dozens and dozens of times. This is something that I know he really detests. He doesn't like the hagiographical mode, and I'm mostly doing this so that you can get to see him shrug off this introduction and move straight into the pure desubjectivizing realm of thought. But while I've got the microphone, I'm going to throw in some compliments towards him. So Jon Roffe is the author. His doctoral thesis has turned into the remarkable book Badiou's Deleuze. He's the author of Abstract Market Theory, a book so revolutionary in addressing a subject that many people care about, an attempt to write a metaphysics of the market, a book so radical in the innocence of its philosophical thinking that no one has or ever will read it. It like Hume's treatise on human nature, it fell stillborn from the press. He has written dozens of articles on Gilles Deleuze and taught the legendary Deleuze seminar series for the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy over 20 years. He also recently released in 2020 the first volume of the works of Gilles Deleuze. Thing to say about Jon is, well, there's a couple of things. First, he is the founding convener of the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. I don't know when he founded the school with 6 others, whether he actually went up a mountain, stared into the middle distance, and muttered to himself, "A terrible beauty is born." But if I have my way, that will feature in the Hollywood film of the birth of the MSCP, where Jon Roffe will be played by someone like Jude Law. Everyone that I can think of, doubtless many people in the Melbourne, owe a great debt to Jon for knowledge of Deleuze, and among my philosophical heroes who are among the living, I can think of no purer philosopher than Jon Roffe. It's always an honor to introduce him. I always feel that my most extravagant statements can't do him justice. So with these two magnificent, please make speakers with us. Please make Dr. Roffe welcome, and I will shut up and let us... Over to you, Dr.
Roffe. Bryan's right. I despise it. I despise it. Not because of the lovely things that Bryan says, it's that he says them out loud and in front of other people. Before I talk about what I'm going to talk about, I do want to say thank you to Matt, who basically tricked me into doing this with his kindness, and everyone that's helped put this together. I think it's incredible. This is the same spirit that animates the MSCP. That's important. And I would say about the university, that philosophy always lives here, places like this, in situations like this, with the tenuousness of situations like this first. This is where it comes from and lives. The MSCP was started because we were sick of the way that the university was mediating our relationship to philosophy. And we wanted a more direct way of talking about what we cared about and talking about it with others. I was a bad convener. Bryan was an excellent convener. So it's my pleasure to be introduced by Bryan for that reason. Like this invitation to speak here in general, Matt kind of tricked me into talking on this topic as well, once again with his kindness. It's a topic that I have been thinking about sort of in the margins for a long time and never had the courage to present anywhere necessarily. The topic is surfaces, and I've talked about it in other things and in other books, but there is a broader concept of surface, I think, that I'm interested in developing, and this is the thing that I will broadly overview here, very broadly. The abstract made it sound like I knew what I was talking about. This is a lot more of a, let's say, an overly confidently worded survey of an introduction. I had a quote at the top of this specifically meant to rile up George, who was meant to be on the panel with us. This line from Hesiod, "First came the chasm." Because the word chasm here could also be translated as chaos, something that I'd like for it not to be translated as, but in any case. So I'm just going to call this surfaces. The work I'd like to discuss here first arose out of a passage in a textbook on the physics of surfaces, out of the laughter that shattered as I read that passage, a familiar landmark of my thought, our thought, in fact, the age-old subordination of surfaces to solids. Here's the passage in question. It's not going to sound very surprising or interesting when I read it. We create a surface of area A from the infinite solid by a cleavage process. Since the bulk does not spontaneously cleave, the total energy of the system must increase by an amount proportional to A. The constant of proportionality is called surface tension. Now, three things should hold our attention in this passage, I think. First, the definition of the surface that is based on a pre-existent solid. Second, the postulation that this solid be an infinite solid. And third, the insistence that, I quote, the bulk does not spontaneously cleave. So let me just read the first sentence of the definition again. We create a surface of area A from the infinite solid by a cleavage process. Why did I laugh? And what explained my burst of laughter? Well, first of all, it was the fact that this passage from Andrew Zangwill's 1988 book, Physics at Surfaces, so closely resembled another much earlier text. And I quote, "In general, we must consider that all stones are formed from some pure and homogeneous matter as the result of a conflux or percolation, or because the matter has been separated in some other way." Now, minus the mathematical dress, this passage already made the same point as the previous one. It appears in a text called On Stones, a 2nd century treatise by the Aristotelian Theophrastus. This idea of a primordial solid from which all others are cleaved is lovingly mocked by the great French poet Francis Ponge in his poem Pebbles. He starts by saying, "Don't blame me for going back even further than the flood." And then it admonishes us with this, before writing, "All rocks are formed through the scissorparity of its single enormous ancestor. Of this fabulous body we have but one thing to say, once out of the abyss, it didn't hold up." And now, Ponge writes, "The chopped up cadaver of the world's greatest being now serves only as a backdrop to the lives of millions of beings infinitely smaller and more ephemeral than itself." Let me return, though, to the second and third point that I've extracted from Zangwill, that the physics of surfaces, our understanding of what a surface is in physics terms, presupposes the starting point of an infinite solid, lacking in any division, and that a blow from without, outside of an infinite solid, must come to introduce a scission and to produce a surface. What forms a common part of mythical cosmogonies now appears as the starting point of a branch of physics. So I'm going to talk about philosophy, mathematics, and then 3 ways forward. They're the headings that I'm going to discuss. If we had more time, we could profitably dwell at length on Zangwill and the other books on the physics of surfaces that invoke the same quasi-mathematical, quasi-mystical presupposition. But the problem here is much older and much more general. What is a surface? What are its characteristics? In almost every direction, the answer to these questions begins by positing a solid and then awkwardly and unsuccessfully, in my view, grounding the analysis of surfaces on this posit. The problems that arise when attempts are made to define surfaces in terms of solids are in fact a constant feature of the history of Western philosophy, predating not just the modern physics of surfaces, but also Theophrastus himself in the 2nd century. Aristotle was perhaps the first to encounter these problems in a rigorous context. In the Physics, when discussing the notion of continuity of bodies, he notes that two bodies can be said to be continuous when, I quote, their extremities are one. In other words, that they share a surface. Surfaces where the two bodies join have some peculiar characteristics according to Aristotle. First, they are indivisible as surfaces, not being bodies themselves. Bodies being divisible, indivisible surfaces. He says the same thing about lines in this context. Second, as a common boundary, this point of joining, they seem to come into existence when the bodies encounter each other while destroying the pre-existing surfaces of the independent bodies. Then when separated, these earlier surfaces are immediately produced again. There's a spontaneous destruction and creation of surfaces anytime two things come into contact with one another. And third, most perplexing of all, and this is from the metaphysics, these surfaces have a very strange claim to being. He writes, body is bounded by these, and they are thought to be capable of existing without a body, but a body cannot exist without them. So we get this strange sense that while surfaces can be created and destroyed all the times by bodies joining, they have a kind of independence that nevertheless can never, is not an independence of the kind that bodies have. And all of this leads to a remarkable line of Aristotle's. It baffles us to say what being is and what the substance of things is. That's what closes out that section of the metaphysics. Very strange. In the scholastic and early modern periods, as was often the case, of course, this problem in Aristotelian physics reappears in religious dress. It repeats itself, notably in Suarez and in Duns Scotus. I'm not going to burden you with that today. And then later in Bayle's presentation of Spinoza. But in this historical period, perhaps the most notable example is provided by Descartes in a well-known text in the disputation with Arnaud in the Objections and Replies to the Meditations. There, Descartes and Arnaud discuss how it could be that during the Eucharist, the moment where the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Christ, the surface of the bread and the wine remain as they were, while the substance of the bodies themselves is transformed. Descartes is convinced that, as he says, all mathematicians and philosophers agree that surfaces are distinct from bodies, and that surfaces lack depth. Now, this claim is one that I would contest, but we haven't got time today. He argues that surfaces must be considered to be modes or modifications of bodies as a result, rather than anything more substantive. By making them more substantive, it would make a surface, let me start that again. He argues that surfaces must be considered to be modes or modifications of bodies rather than anything more substantive. But then he also points out that the surface of the bread and wine are also shared surfaces with the air around them. This would mean that the surface must be really distinct from the bodies that it relates to, seeming to grant it, despite his earlier point, a kind of substantiality of a stronger kind than the bread and wine themselves, which can be transformed. Later, we can even see the surface-solid opposition in Kant's distinction between phenomena and noumena, where the object of sensation that feeds into the transcendental subject and its machinery of faculties must encounter the in itself, but without being able to grasp it conceptually. Only the surface of the real is encountered, and it is only encountered in sensation. But, and this amounts to really a restatement of Kant's famous empirical realism, the real itself must exist behind it, the corpus whose surface furnishes sensibility with its content. So in other words, we find a kind of, I could give you many more examples, restatement of similar problems from Aristotle all the way through Kant, that are versions of the surface solid pair. Now there's a common lesson, moving into the mathematics section now. There's a common lesson of the many thinkers, examples of which we could greatly multiply, who address these issues in the history of Western philosophy. We cannot think solids without thinking their surfaces, while being unable, because of the primary commitment to the being of solids, to give a coherent definition of surfaces. What's the way out of this seemingly insuperable set of difficulties? Well, one solution remains, essentially, to think surfaces directly and to conceive them on their own terms. And then, by way of consequence, this would be the next step that I'm not going to talk about, to reconceive the being of solids on the basis of surfaces. Now, all of this might seem to be a rather tall order, but for the fact that it has already been accomplished in mathematics. Euclidean geometry, a synthesis and generalization of the results of empirical investigation, architectural and land survey results, already includes a theory of surfaces that, however inflected by these empirical results, allows us to think surfaces directly. Later, the intrinsic geometry developed by Gauss and then Riemann, which provides a means for addressing the structure of a space without reference to an ambient outside, breaks with any need to think of surfaces in any terms other than their own. While it's not a particularly remarkable observation, it's true that theoretical physics often reflects existing, however latent, philosophical commitments that are antithetical to the mathematical frameworks that it deploys. This latent tension, I think, is most strikingly the case in the ways in which the intrinsic differential mathematics of surfaces is undercut by the constant reference to properties of solids in order to account for the nature of surfaces in physics. So if you read these physics books, you find this constant recursion to geometry, and then these equally constant references to infinite solids. In summary terms then, the contemporary physics of surfaces presents an account that awkwardly blends together the pre-Gaussian mathematics and pre-critical metaphysics. Gauss, Riemann, and post-Riemannian geometry break with any need to invoke extrinsic factors, such as a primary solid volume or ambient space, when directly thinking the mathematics of surfaces. What is also required, though, is a development on the side of philosophy that achieves the same break. Now, let me insist again that the power of post-Euclidean thought of surfaces and manifolds in mathematics does not arise because it is a purified version of the physics of surfaces, but because it bears no longer any relation to them. Now, and this is the three ways forward part, the final part of what I want to say. In my remaining time, I want to very briefly consider three conceptual topoi that seem to allow a way forward, or at least instances where we can begin to think about surfaces differently. There also happen to be topoi that have been frequently misunderstood because of a latent solid surface opposition of the traditional kind. These are the concept of the image, the Leibnizian notion of the fold, and Raymond Rouillet's account of the embryo in terms of an absolute surface. None of these on their own constitute an adequate philosophy of the surface, but each points to a way of addressing a set of cases that are often made sense of by invoking a primary solidity or isolated interiority in a way that grants the surface its independence. So in other words, we want to take these three instances and use them as, rethink them without having recourse to this idea of a primary solid. So the first is the image. The concept of the image has, since Plato really, been given a second-hand demoted reality, always conceived in relation to either the underlying thing of which it is the image, or really more recently, to the perceiving subject for whom alone the image has a being. Surface and substrate appear once again in their familiar arrangement. Now, as Raymond Rouillé points out, images have only one side. They are necessarily surfaces. Rouillé says, you know, if an image had two sides, it would be an object. How can we develop this idea of one-sided images as surfaces without returning back to the problem that we've kind of briefly identified? Well, what we need, essentially, is a concept of the image that leaves no room for either subjective idealism or representationally oriented materialism. Now, of course, as I'm sure is well known, just such a concept of the image is developed already by Henri Bergson in Matter and Memory. According to a famous passage there, matter is an aggregate of images. And by image, we mean a certain existence which is more than what the idealist calls a representation, but less than what the realist calls a thing. An existence placed halfway between the thing and the representation. So, and really Matter and Memory is based on this rethinking of what is first. And what is first is a surface, an image, images. Of course, this is not to say that the subjective perception is nothing other than the coincidence of our consciousness with the image. Bergson famously argues that perception functions to filter out those elements of the image that do not contribute to the ongoing prosecution of agency. We have less than what's in the image. But beyond what Bergson has to say about the image-consciousness relationship, more important is the claim that images as surfaces do not possess a second-hand or derivative reality. They are directly real, they are the components of reality itself. And this allows us to extend Bergson's framework beyond what Bergson himself talks about in Matter and Memory to consider artistic images, advertising, indeed all mediatized image presentation, directly as a regime of beings with their own immanent rules for operation. Once we take the decision to leave behind the opposition between surface and solid, we gain access to the image to the same degree that post-Euclidean geometry attains a direct thought of a surface, only now while including images of a much broader scope. Second, folds. Okay, but what would a broader theory of matter that begins with the concept of the surface look like? We're given a theory of this kind in Leibniz's lesser-known theory of the fold. I say lesser-known, but Deleuze has popularized this sort of minor element of Leibniz's work. And in a sense, we can see what Leibniz is doing here is breaking with the problematic leftovers of Aristotelian physics in Descartes. Leibniz's real intervention into the problematic field of post-Cartesian physics is the rejection of atomic homogeneous solids, whose interactions give rise to such strange consequences from within Kantianism, and we touched on some of them. In its place is the image of an elastic surface whose folds give matter its texture, which is its nature. Leibniz writes, "The division of matter must not be considered like that of sand into grains, but like that of a sheet of paper or a tunic into folds, in such a way that it can have an infinity of folds, some smaller than others, without the body ever dissolving into points or minima." All of this brings us back, strangely enough perhaps, to the figure of the FOPA image of the egg, or to be more precise, to embryogenesis as a process. Now here again, the regressive tendencies of physics still dominate our common view of the genesis of living beings, although this is less and less the case as time goes on. This common view presents the embryo as a composition partes extra partes, that is, a composition that takes place through the addition of solid parts one to the other, next to each other. Once we hold this view, the Lego building view of embryogenesis, all of the issues that already troubled Aristotle and Descartes return with a vengeance, ramified by the additional challenges posed by the fact that the embryo is a being in transformation and not some abstract philosophical example. Instead, and this is Rouillé's term, we must conceive of the embryo as an absolute surface. There is no hidden depth or underlying substance, but instead a co-presence of dynamic processes. Ria says there's no radical elsewhere in the embryo or on the absolute surface. Embryogenesis proceeds through a process of unfolding and folding, the intensive genesis of a new being through the playing out, not without false steps and contingencies, of itself. Already in the genome, its topologically associated domains, or TADs, it's these that give rise to morphogenesis, genes being less a code, as we often hear, than a complex set of active and dynamic neighborhoods that unfold as the being comes into being. The gene, like the embryo and then the brain in its wake, is a surface on whose surface what happens takes place. But we should also note that the brain itself, and not just the human brain, but a range of animal brains, is constructed through the activity of folding, or what is amusingly called gyrification. And that it too is a complex of surfaces that cannot be understood with any reference to an underlying substratum. So, of course, we knew the truth all along. It's the egg that comes first. And the egg provides us with an important point of view on the primacy of surfaces. We can and should start with the embryo when thinking of surfaces, rather than with the strange vestigial spectre of an abstract infinite solid and the equally spectral cleavage that leaves us with intractable logical and ontological issues. Thank you. A little bit of metaphysics for the weekend.
Matt, sorry, just protocol questions now or to Dan? Yeah, that's okay, Dan, please.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Thanks to everybody else who contributed to the organisation of this event, which I'm very pleased to be a part of. It's, as Jon himself, as Bryan said, it's not that clear what para-academia might mean, but to me it means something, and it means a question. And my belief is that questions arise when it's the right time for those questions to arise. And this is the right time, and so I think it's good for us to ask a little bit about that question of what para-academia might mean and why it becomes a question today. I should clarify, I have worked a little bit in universities for 7 or 8 years. I taught in the Masters of Education program at the University of Melbourne, but as I always tell people, that was all just bullshit. And it was just easy to just show up and teach it and go home and do what I was doing. So nevertheless, the statement is basically true. In other words, I was very lucky. I was very lucky that I didn't have to work in the university. The conditions of that luck were not always good conditions, but nevertheless, I consider it fortunate that I was able to avoid a lot of the problems that come with working in the university, because there are a lot of problems in the university today. Jacques Derrida used to talk about the university without conditions, but aside from the fact that that's means nothing to me, there will always be conditions for the university. The university should have conditions. Aside from that, those conditions only become more and more painful over time. That said, the other reason I think it's worth caring about para-academia is because there's another kind of problem in the university too, not just the problem from above, but the problem of the academics themselves, which is that a lot of them are cowards. And what I mean by that, above all, is that the problems that the university faces, whether you call it neoliberalism or that type of thing, but also problems to do today with the arrival of AI, artificial intelligence, are problems that the academics themselves do not wish to face, or do not wish to face in the root of those problems. They might want to live off those problems, but living off them as they go down. And so in those circumstances, the question of para-academia is very important. And we can say that it's a question that has and that includes MSCP, etc. as well, which I've loved to work for, not only because I never have to mark any essays. We can say that this question has been brewing for 30 years. In other words, since the internet, since digital technology became web technology, network technology. And this is a question we have to ask. And we can ask it first, remembering that it's not the first time questions have arisen that lead to the formation of these kinds of institutions, as you call it on the website. What do I mean? For example, well, what is digital technology? It's a kind of writing. It's a new kind of writing. Well, when was the last time a new kind of writing arrived? We could say the printing press. And among the printing press, there are many, many consequences, as you know, including Reformation, and in a way, the Industrial Revolution, but also the Republic of Letters in France. In other words, the salons, the exchange of letters outside the university, but making possible the modernity of French thought, the Enlightenment to it, and so on. In other words, the advent of a new kind of writing disrupts existing programs of society, which means that those programs stop functioning as well, which means that questions emerge, and where those questions are also pathways to different futures. So in the abstract that I wrote, I mentioned AI. So what I want to say to you is that, as I guess I am a kind of philosopher, or at least I like to pretend I am, and that if we want to understand what the advent of this new stage of this new kind of writing is, then we need philosophy to understand it. Now, that's not something you should just take on faith or as obvious. It's an assertion. I'm making the claim that we are better off if we think about these questions with philosophy rather than without it. So it's up to me to show you that. How? As you heard in the introduction, I'm connected with a guy named Bernard Stiegler. Bernard Stiegler himself became a philosopher outside the university. How did he become a philosopher? He was in prison, not for any kind of political crime, but because he was a bank robber. I don't know how many of you know about Bernard Stiegler. He ran a bar, jazz bar, in the 1970s. And one of the customers at that bar was also a friend of his and was a philosopher, Gerard Grenell. When he went to prison, Grenell would visit him in prison and bring books and talk to him about philosophy. And Bernard insisted that he go into solitary confinement while he was in prison. And while he was there, he just read and wrote and read and wrote and took notes on what he wrote and condensed those notes, and eventually enrolled at the University of Toulouse. And when he came out of prison, before he came out of prison, he wrote a letter to Jacques Derrida and asked if it would be possible to work with him, and Derrida ended up supervising his thesis. And from 1994 until 2020, he published about 35 books. And for me, there is no future for philosophy that does not go through this guy. I'm a #1 paid-up member of the Stiegler cult. Now, that might sound stupid, right? But we are all stupid, not just me, and we're becoming stupider, which is bad news. On the other hand, we always will be stupid, and we always will be becoming stupid in one way or another. More than that, we need to be stupid. We need to be stupid in the sense that stupidity is what makes us reflect and have another thought. In other words, stupidity is connected with questions. I'm stupid, I'm saying I'm stupid, I'm stupidly in love with Bernard Stiegler, crazy in love, as Beyonce would say. But I believe that we need him in order to understand what's happening with AI. And first of all, why? Because most approaches to AI, whether they're technophilic or technophobic, start from analogies between the brain and the computer, or the animal and the machine. And you can find these in the history of philosophy, but you also can find them questioned in the history of philosophy, for instance by Georges Canguilhem, who said that this is part of an ideology, and he said it quite a long time ago, at the end of his life. And more recently was said in a book that I translated, the first time I translated a book not by Bernard Stiegler, but by a French woman named Anne Lambert, and this book will come out very soon, called Digital Schizophrenia, in which she takes up what Canguilhem says in order to make the point. This way of thinking, by analogy, has on one side the brain or the animal, and on the other side the computer or the machine. But we cannot think, and we should not think, the computer or the machine without the organism that creates that machine and which is part of that machine, us. And at the same time, what Bernard Stiegler argues is that we ourselves are not just human beings like an animal. Why not? Because how did we come into being human beings? Where did we come from? We're a product of evolution, but we're not only a product of evolution in the sense that long before there are Homo sapiens, there is already underway an interruption of that biological evolutionary process through the advent of a technical evolutionary process of, for example, stone tools. There are stone tools long, long, long before human beings. And because this is long, long before, we cannot say, do these tools evolve from one face to two faces and so on because our brains get bigger, or because we're working with tools, does this produce an evolutionary process, an artificial evolutionary process that leads to our brains getting bigger? Not to mention the defunctionalization of the front feet into becoming hands and so on. In other words, the rhythm of the evolution of the stone tools and the rhythm of the evolution of pre-human life is so slow but simultaneous that we cannot judge what is the causality. In other words, the species that we are is the outcome of a technical process already. So we have no origin that is not already technical. What does this mean? It means that we are always entangled with our tools from the beginning, and we are always trying to create systems to live with these tools. And in the beginning, these systems unfold very, very slowly so that those who live within them are not aware of the relationship of all of these things together. They're not aware of the fact that they live in a world of becoming, of change. Only much more recently do we begin to know that. But nevertheless, for the beings that we are, it always was the case. In that process, a very important step occurs when I need to say this. A stone tool is a memory. We can look at a stone tool and know about the past. The past is kept in that tool, and we can learn how that tool was made. But it wasn't made for memory. But at a certain point, we begin to make tools for memory, for instance, with cave painting. But that is only maximum a few tens of thousands of years, whereas stone tools is 2 or 3 million years. It's very, very recent in that unfolding history. And this begins a new stage of the necessity of taking care of the way we live with memory systems. We are constantly producing a new object, and that object is disadjusting us from the way we live, which is causing us a problem, which is causing us to have to rethink how we live and produce new programs and so on. There's nothing new here. What AI is doing in that way is very, very old. But we have to pay attention not only to what is old, but to what is new as well. One of the great things, how am I doing? One of the great things about Stiegler is that he understood very clearly that if there are these technologies that are about memory, then what happened in the 19th century with the Industrial Revolution also has to be understood as a question of a new kind of memory technology. What kind? If you think of the mechanical loom, what does it do? It takes the gestures of the worker with a tool who knows, because he or she has been initiated into the art of weaving transgenerationally. It takes what that worker knows, what those gestures are, and programs it into a machine that is powered by a steam engine, etc. It takes the knowledge and turns it into information. This is the beginning of automation. Now, Marx would call this proletarianization. When Marx says proletarianization, what does he mean? He means that the knowledge is taken out of the hands of the workers, put into the hands of the capitalists, and in so doing, it becomes information, and the population is divided into two big classes. But it means more than that for Stiegler. It means that because we are losing the capacity to know, we lose the capacity to think and to remember. Who was the philosopher who said this first? Not Karl Marx, but Socrates. Socrates said it about what? About writing. Writing as a pharmacon. In other words, both a cure and a poison. A cure and a poison for memory, because in making this speech, instead of just saying what I think, I just read the words and memorize and don't have to think for myself. So for Socrates, as Derrida reminded us very much later, writing is a pharmacon in the sense that we cannot ever decide whether it's a poison or a cure, because it is always both. We cannot decide whether it is an aid for memory, because it does help us to remember, or a poison for memory, because it helps us to forget, because it always does both. Now, I haven't got time to go through all the steps that lead from there to what I would want to say about AI, but I think we've got plenty of time left. But what I want to say is that this is the key problematic that we have to think about if we want to understand what's happening with AI, which is another stage of writing as it was described by Socrates, of a form of automation of writing that remembers for us, that claims to think for us, but which, insofar as what it does is never to produce new content, but only to mix up and mix around old content as a kind of metabolic process, an assimilation that spits something else out, shit mostly. As this kind of process, it raises the question for us, including for academics, including for the university, including for all institutions, the question of whether this kind of algorithmic writing, very powerful and very rapid, can be a tool that is not opposed to us as the analogy of the brain and the computer, or the brain and the computer, or the animal and the machine would like to imagine, or if there is a way in which our entanglement with this form of writing can in fact contribute to the unfolding history of that entanglement, which is what produces the flourishing of our individual singularities and our collective singularities through the differences between us. But I probably should stop there.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Look, what I'm going to do now is just it's a bit embarrassing to be frequently chosen to perform this kind of role, but has a purely dilatory function, right? So I'm just going to delay the moment of you getting a chance to ask these two gentlemen questions by asking them each a question from myself. Just supposed to give you more time to think about what it is that you want to ask them. So I'll ask one to Daniel and then to Jon. Daniel, okay. Please correct anything that I say in this question that needs correcting. But if I understand correctly, so the connection between proletarianization and the pharmacon, right? So the pharmacon, writing is the paradigm. It is a technology that acts, as Plato says, as an aid to memory, but for that reason, it's also a kind of forgetting apparatus. It allows the forgetting to become possible. With proletarianization, with the first industrial revolution and its subsequent ones, you get actual proletarianization, meaning that process of forgetting starts to interfere with cultural transmission, with what I think Stigler, taking from Husserl, calls tertiary retention, and so forth. The question I want to ask you, though, is, does AI, in your thinking, just fit into that paradigm, like as yet another technological development that holds further tragic ecological consequences, like that threatens to exacerbate proletarianization? Or is there something even more dire at stake? And I'll tell you what I mean by this. So probably where the automaton, automata, these terms are often used by ancient Greeks. They talk about like the machines of Hephaestus and so forth in relation to ideas of slavery, that there's this notion of a being that can work without really working. That can work, our friend Oliver Feltham wrote a thesis about this, as fire burns. And The interesting thing about this is, thinking of Marx, is I think in part of the history of proletarianization is also the history of people needing to labor to simulate the existence of automata when you didn't really have automation. As in, the capitalist is kind of like, it's just the machines doing all of the work. But then your job, a lot of your jobs, is almost maintaining that illusion that labor is automated, but with actual human labor, with use, as Marx says, of nerve and tissue fibers. And I'm wondering, how you think AI fits into or may make a break in some ways with that broader paradigm of proletarianization and pharmacology, which the way you set it out, goes back to, is involved in anthropogenesis, right? So how much is continuous and how much is there a rupture? That's my question, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, right. It's important to say that that the way that I described the advent of proletarianization in the Industrial Revolution was through the machinery of the Industrial Revolution that programs the gestures of the worker. And it's I think Simondon says something similar to what I think you're saying about this being a kind of intermediate stage where the machine is what actually Simondon says is that the tool-equipped man is what exists before you get to the real automation of the machine, and is the man serving the tool when it should be the other way around, etc., something like that. So it's, in a way, he's kind of positive turn on Marx there. But I think that what is more important in this consideration of proletarianization as a process of a loss of knowledge by turning it into information is that if Marx is the source of our modern understanding of that, he's still a historical source. In other words, things happened after him that he didn't anticipate. And they happened not very long after him. And this is what Stiegler wants to discuss in the 20th century as the advent of new forms of grammatization with new forms of memory technologies, specifically radio, television, cinema, analog, audiovisual technologies. Why do they matter? As you would know, Marx has this idea about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. That as the information that's programmed into those machines gets spread around the capitalists, then the ability to make money off it gets more and more difficult. And so in the end, they won't end up making money. And economists like to say, oh, look, Marx was totally wrong. Look, nobody's having any trouble making money. They're still making it. But you have to also think about the other steps of the process. And one of the most important steps is the advent of audio-visual technology, which did what? Which made it possible to create markets for goods. In other words, the desire for goods that did not exist before. The wish to have goods that nobody ever wished for before. How do they make that possible? Because these are the technologies of consciousness that very quickly become the technologies of marketing. And one of the main points that Stiegler wants to make is that a big problem in French philosophy is that it drops the whole question of economics and never really takes up the question of marketing. You can find it in a little bit in Foucault, and you can certainly see the Deleuzian idea of the control society in that light. However, in relation to that, I would say what's important to remember then is that this is when Deleuze is starting to have some questions about his own position in Anti-Oedipus, about the desiring machines, and the positivity of this starts to become more problematic. I mean, you know more about this than me, and no doubt I defer to your authority, but But to me, it's necessary to see that as we have to understand that process, and we have to understand there's a question there: what is desire and what is machine in these terms? This won't mean anything to some of you, no doubt, but I still think it's important because there is this gap in French philosophy around these questions. How that changes the situation is that when you can create the market in advance of the product, then you can continue to make profit. So it's very important to take advantage of these technologies, and the 20th century is essentially the century of refining those techniques. But in some ways, they're still rough. They're still rough because, you know, you can get the ratings back from the TV, but it's a one-way, but that's a very minimal two-way street. You don't get very much back if you're an advertiser from knowing the ratings of TV shows. With the invention of algorithmic technologies, you have an extremely detailed and rapid and instantaneous or near instantaneous two-way street of data that is telling you everything about whether or not what you're doing works or not, and allows much more refinement. So in this way, even before you get to the question of AI that's arisen with ChatGPT and so on, these technologies are definitely a new step in the degree to which they can operate so rapidly and with such a large amount of information that in a lot of ways they're more rapid than your ability to make decisions. And in short-circuiting your ability to make decisions, because it's already anticipating the decisions you might make and nudging you in one way or another. Because of that, what's being automated is your mind. Now, I think it's important to say automation is not bad, and automatisms of your mind are not bad. They're not bad in and of themselves. For example, if you want to learn to play the piano properly, you have to do your scales. And you have to do them over and over and over again in order to make them into automatisms, which means that they're in your brain. And you can do it without any thought process. In the same way as when you're driving, a lot of time you're not even thinking about what you're doing. But it's only not bad because that automatism can be disautomatized when you play the piano really well. In other words, the freedom to play with your instrument, which is the only real freedom, is a product of interiorizing automatisms. So it's not that automatisms are bad, it's not that automation is bad. It's whether or not those automatisms serve de-automatizing processes, which is, in other words, making you autonomous. Autonomy comes from automatism. They're not oppositions. The question of AI, to get to what you're saying, yes, I think it's simply an extension of this process. And you know, it's easy to give very clear examples, basic ones. Like I know a woman who works for a media company that's connected with horse racing, and she has to do the social media blah 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 posts about if they're tipsters blah blah, and she doesn't know anything about horse racing, so she just puts in to ChatGPT, come up with a clever slogan for this, you know, post or whatever, and it does it, and she just does it. So she's automatizing her work. And of course, for her, it's more efficient. She doesn't want to know about horse racing, got no interest. So for her, it's good in this way. But even her, she knows in some way she's cheating. And she's cheating her own ability to develop the skill that she needs for the work that she's doing. But it's extremely tempting to do that, especially when you're holding down 3 jobs and whatever, you're going to do it. So you know, she doesn't feel too guilty. But you have to see these things in terms of the tendencies and the process. It doesn't matter about whether one person gets something out of it. What matters is whether you're sucking the energy and the life out of everybody, because nobody knows how to do anything, and this is why I'm saying that we're getting stupider. And stupid means also more lazy, more prone to denial, more cowardly, as I already said, and more resentful. And these are all the characteristics of the politics that we see today. And so it's easy, sometimes people take an attitude towards Stiegler like he's just a doomsayer. But, I mean, look around.
All right. Excellent. Thank you very much for that, Daniel. All right, Jon, slightly caveats, because slightly obscene question for you, because it touches in a sense on the motivations for reflections on surfaces, but I want to be clear that it seems to me that one of the things one gets out of such a correction of the inability to think surfaces, or the subordination of surfaces to the thought of surfaces to that of solids, the incoherence of the concept, is that it allows you to, in a way, have done with interiority and other kinds of bad metaphysics, certain dualisms, transcendental idealism, and so forth. Although I note that you said it, one of the problems with the metaphysics that attaches even to the physics of surfaces contra the mathematics is that it's a pre-critical metaphysics. But in any case, I have this vague recollection that I may have screwed up, that in the book on abstract market theory, you talk about the market as a pure surface of price. And I suppose my question has two about one. I'd like you to speak to that, if you could, what that means, what the especially given some of the things Daniel has been said, what the theory of a genuine, real theory of surfaces, the implications that has for thinking of the market. Second part, I feel that, but I could be wrong, that part of what you're doing here, not that one needs any reason to correct kind of metaphysical errors or bad concepts, right? Like that's a sufficient reason in itself. But I also, what was I going to say? Yeah, that's right. Have the sense that one of the things that might be motivating this thought is thinking about our tendency, maybe particularly dealing with social things like technology, things like cinema, some of the things that Daniel has been talking about, to simulate things like the market and capital, to have a kind of incoherent metaphysics where one simultaneously says these things have determinate effects, either dominating and hegemonic effects, and yet they're also not real because they're kind of simulacra. It's a realm of pure representation. So yeah, I've got a sense that part of what you're trying to do is to give the appropriate metaphysics to these things that so obviously play such a role in our lives. And just a third little appendix to that is, I noticed, if I'm not mistaken, that your opening was a direct reference to the big opening of Les Mots et les Choses, to Foucault talking about reading a passage in Borges and so forth, and just wondered whether you had anything else to say about that. Thanks, Jon.
Thank you. Great questions. Yes, obviously I was ripping off Foucault. It amused me. It was lengthier as well, but it seemed increasingly ridiculous to talk about it in the terms that Foucault talks about categories of the same and the other. But yes, I mean, at the same time, I think it seems clear to me, given how many times the problem recurs in the history of Western philosophy, and gives rise to this kind of set of antinomies, and problems. That it is a very significant thing to address. Whether I can address it or not is a separate question. So it has that significance to me, as the same way that Foucault takes this issue of taxonomy. Taxonomy are in the same and the other in the order of things. I'll answer in reverse order. Yes, I mean the essential motivation here is obviously I love metaphysics. It's a sick attachment, but here we are. But yeah, my real concern is just that if we have this kind of conception going on in the background, it means that we're liable to make these kinds of misunderstandings about the relationship between a cinematic image, for instance, the function of it, how it works and what it is. We confuse these things because we are like trying to play both sides of the distinction, if you like. If we can instead formulate a positive concept of the image, we can clear away a lot of those things and look at the way that the image functions as a surface, rather than, saying, oh, it's effective, but it's also just pure nothing.
Which is
not
incoherent.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So yeah, the generality of the concept of the surface is that partly what's at issue there. It reveals itself in lots of different ways. But to come back to your first question, yes, that was really the first, in my book on the market, I define the market as a surface for the inscription of price. And that's really the first application of these ideas, really the thing that really started me thinking about them. However, I'm going to be the jerk that says this, but in my next book on economics, really it's this Stiglerian understanding of memory that becomes more crucial. And I think that fundamentally you have to understand money as a mnemotechnical apparatus, and that the market surface is an element, fundamentally in the end, an element of a layer of money, fundamentally. One register of memory playing out there. So the reason why it's important, it's one thing about the market as a surface, the reason it's important to think about the market as a surface is that it's not an agent. First of all, let's be very clear about that. The market does nothing. It is no one. It is the register of transactions, past transactions, that recurses and affects future monetary interactions. So it's very clearly a memory in Stigler's sense, a tertiary memory. The problem with, I guess, the way that I formulated it in that book, I think, is that it made it reified it a bit too much. And I think by incorporating the market as a mnemic layer of money, we go further. And I think we can address some of those lacunae that you pointed out. It's certainly true that economics was addressed in second half of the 20th century French philosophy only sparingly. And marketing the same. Certainly marketing in the sense that you're talking about, the functioning of desire to produce fantasy, right? Nothing like that is in Anti-Oedipus at all. Yeah, they certainly are not interested in that. I would like to bring together the surface and memory, the way that we've been talking about it here, in a more broad way, but yeah, first of all, in terms of money.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Jon. All right, you've been very patient. I have more questions for these gentlemen, and at some point I want them to also kind of respond to each other, but you've been very, very patient. It's now time to open the floor. Matt's going to bring the microphone around, so please ask this gentleman what you wish.
Yeah, it's a question for Jon. I wanted to ask you about the point on the line in relation to the surface and the solid. I mean, in Euclid, you start with a point and then the line, and then you get the surface.
Yes.
Or the solid. And and I was thinking about Plato's Timaeus, where we've got triangles that make up everything, which are kind of surfaces, I guess, but made of lines. Although maybe they didn't have the great take-up after that. And also the science of where the numbers first got applied to physics, I guess, was the Pythagoreans with lengths of string, the ratios of the length of string related to the sound of the strings made in the musical instruments. So, and then they're flowing right through to string theory, although I hear that that's actually more like a two-dimensional thing. It's more like a surface, so that supports your idea. But, and then we've got point particles in physics play a role. And I was thinking of your example of the market. Why is it a surface? I mean, you could think of it as a feedback loop, which, the way you described it, which seems more like a line. So there's just some thoughts about how about the role for the point and the line as well as the surface and the solid.
Sure, great question. I guess I was asking for that as well, obviously. I mean, a few observations, I guess. First of all, shout out to my fellow Timaeus readers. We don't really use the name out loud many places. As you said, it's not really the most popular Platonic dialogue for a variety of reasons. I think what I'd say first of all is that, like, obviously the Euclidean construction of point-line surface has been overtaken on each point, if I can say that. That the point and the line themselves have been transformed by Riemannian differential geometry. Now, I wish I had something more substantial to say about it, other than simply to note that no, I can't really. Many of the things that are sort of just in the ring around the things that I've said are unclear to me at the moment. I'll tell you that. I feel very stupid in that regard. The line matters to me a great deal. I'm afraid I can't say more on that point. Moving on, though. Yes, is the market, a recursive relation and therefore temporal or linear in character? I guess I'd rather say that the market is a surface of inscription that is latent and impassive and passive on its own terms. What is linear and, as it were, processual and temporal is rather pricing and evaluating, which happened before and after. So pricing happens, it's inscribed on the market, and then subsequent acts of valuing, like is this valuable to me, are affected by the inscribed prices on the market. So it's as though that the social memory of that's latent in the background is affecting the way that we value things as subjects and as societies. So there is absolutely a process going on, but it's not a process that the market itself is the agent of. The market is this surface across which processes of evaluation are modulated, as it were. You can imagine a field, the way that it gets rivulets cut through as water runs through it, creating divots and movements, and that subsequent water that flows over it is channeled and affected. We can see the surface there, the field, as the surface of the market, inscribed by pricing, and then subsequent acts of valuation being kind of guided or modulated by the kind of terrain of the market. That would be the way to describe that. If I can have if I can come back to you on the point in the line, I would like that.
Hey, I just have an observation. I think at least a lot of people in my life aren't very disciplined, but they are very busy. And I guess I think a lot of what you were saying might have kind of the material to tease out that distinction between, an ostensible kind of lack of discipline everywhere, but at the same time a sort of frenzied busyness.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a good question because it raises doubts about fashionable ways of thinking. And what I mean is, from the 1960s, we had a very strong idea across a large part of the population that grew that we need to free ourselves from repression. We live in a repressive society, and this repressive society is authoritarian. And if we can loosen the bonds, then we'll become free and life will be good. Obviously, what you're thinking of is what I'm saying about the necessity of automatism for another conception of autonomy. And you're right, and it's important. And why is it important? It's important because that notion that came from the 60s, in fact, is what gets taken up by the economics of marketing. That wants you to loosen those bonds as much as possible. To say you don't need to know how to play the piano. You just press the button on the keyboard and it'll, all that stuff. And it'll play by itself. You just need to know how to press a few different buttons and you'll be great. You don't need to listen from your mother or whoever and learn the recipes that she knew from her mother. You don't need that. You just go to McDonald's. In other words, you don't need to do the work that's involved in interiorizing automatisms that will make you autonomous. You can decide to cook this or that. You can decide to play this or that. You can decide to do all kinds of things. You lose all of the ability to make those decisions. And that's why one of the key differences in my mind between Stiegler and other philosophers is that Stiegler really cares. He doesn't just talk about things like the whole world is full of adults. What should adult desire be? He cares about how you get to be an adult. For example, Althusser, it's like schools are oppressive apparatus. Okay, but every single philosopher went to school and learned how to read and write, and if they didn't do that, they wouldn't be a philosopher. There's something you need to know what you're losing before you throw it away. And that also connects with me saying that we're becoming stupider. Because that's a way of saying that today we need to know the problem that of course, there's still repression. There's still repression in the psychological sense. There's still repression in the political sense. Here, there, different places is different. Nevertheless, what I want to say is that, in my view, the real problem we face today is not repression. It's regression. Which means what? If you understand life and the universe as processes that are constantly unfolding, and we can say entropically, then life is a kind of struggle against that turning back into ashes. And technical life, in other words, human life, is a different kind of struggle, not just turning into the averageness of ashes, but turning into the averageness of algorithmic calculation and so on. Struggle requires effort. And if you aren't trying to rise up, if you're not making the effort to rise up, you're already going backwards. And that's why questions arise. You're always becoming lazy. You're always not bothering to work out how to live in this world that's changing. The question is where to find the sources of that discipline. So in other words, what I'm saying to you is, yes, very much so. Foucault wrote a book, Discipline and Punish. Very famous book. What was it about, though? It was about prison. Prison as a place where you learn how to behave because you feel you're being watched at all times, even if you're not. And so your behavior is conditioned. And one of the things that happens after the publication of that book, which is a good book, is that it gets extended to all kinds of other fields, every other field, so that people will say, having an arrangement like this, I am the master, true, but you are all facing me in this arrangement like it's, fascist. It's oppressive. I'm repressing you because you got questions, but I'm the one giving the answers, right? So there's an idea that this is like the prison. But what you have to remember is that discipline has more than one meaning. That's not the only meaning of discipline. Discipline is also the effort that's required in order to automatize behavior so that you can be autonomous. And discipline is also the name of the disciplines, the disciplines of rational knowledge and so on, which we should value. So if you simply extend this analysis of prison, which it may be possible to extend it to other fields, but if in doing that you forget the other sides of discipline, then you end up serving all of those interests that say what matters in your life is not the long term. What matters is not to aim towards something, but to get whatever produces an immediate satisfaction, which is a logic of what? Is a logic of addiction. Marketing follows the logic of addiction. It says, okay, it might not be as good, but you'll get it straight away. And then but it doesn't work. Addiction doesn't make you happy. One of the things that Bernard used to say is the logic of consumerism is the logic of the heroin addict. And what is the logic of the heroin addict? What is the thing I hate most right now? Heroin, or for example, watching commercial crap on TV. I can't stand it, it's terrible. Or watching TikTok or whatever. I don't want to, I can feel my life getting wasted away. It's the worst thing in my life. But what do you want right now? Heroin. Now, if I may, we can connect this to the question of the point. All of what I've said is about memory technology. But memory means nothing unless it's in a relationship to the future. The whole point of saying memory is that I have a history, we have a history, and this history is how we organize our relationship to the future, is what Jon was saying about the market. The market is the history of prices or exchanges that then affects our relationship to the future. But this is not just a calculable relationship as it is on an absolute market. The relationship to the future for us is very different than for a computer. If you want to have a computer that can recognize a picture of a cat, you have to label thousands of pictures of cats, which becomes the history of that computer, which then means that it performs a calculation, says, I say that's a cat, I draw this cat like that, etc. But that's not what we do. We go to meet what comes to us. We anticipate it already on the basis of the past that we've lived, but also the past that we have not lived, but that we've adopted through all the books that we've read, the movies that we've seen, the stories that we've been told, and so on. And this means that even in our perception, we are producing what we perceive. Now, how can I defend that idea? If you think about the invention of the gramophone, this was the first time ever in history that you were able to have exactly the same auditory input twice. And what do you learn? That is not an identical experience. What your brain does, what your brain receives, how your brain interprets, changes. If you listen to a piece of music twice, 100 times, why does it change? It's not because of something spatial. It's because you have changed. Your history has changed. Your memory has changed. And because your memory has changed, you go to meet it differently, which means you interpret it differently, which means you produce it differently. It's a post-production in the perception. In other words, there's an element of fiction and belief involved in all perception. what Stiegler wants to say is that we are beings, unlike animals, who can infinitize our perceptions. For example, the point. The point does not exist. The geometric point does not exist. You can never see it. But we believe in it. And by believing in it, we can produce the line and the surface and the volume and Euclidean geometry. We start by infinitizing something that, as John said, starts from empirical actions, surveying and whatever. But by infinitizing the empirical, we transcendentalize it, let's say. In other words, the transcendental has empirical conditions. In other words, you can't oppose the empirical and transcendental, for those who want to know that bit. But by infinitizing it, we believe in it, which means we desire it. It's the work that we do to infinitize it. It's another kind of discipline. So all of the forms of rational knowledge, all of the things that matter to us are products of this kind of intergenerational work, the roots of which come in the fact that our very perceptions have to be understood as productions in this way, which is why I'm saying you need philosophy to understand why AI can't do what we do, no matter where it goes.
Oh, thanks. This is a question for John, but it does relate to your response there, so thank you for that. John, I just want to get really clear about what you're meaning by surface. And it wasn't very helpful for me as a Platonist. I'm from the Platonic Academy we had the gig on before. To that amazing thing you got from the textbooks, which I've never heard of before, where you have an infinite solid and you cut it and then you get the surface. So I was wondering if I could just maybe give you a picture of where I'm coming from as a Platonist and then see how that connects with your notion of surface. So rather than the point not existing, if you go to the Platonic textbooks, it's all about the point. All existence is in that. And when the point moves, it generates the line. And when the line moves, it generates the plane. And when the plane moves, it generates the surface. And in the mantras they put in the textbooks about this, they also go in the reverse. And they say the limit of the solid is the surface, and the limit of the surface is the line. And as we all know from geometry, if we still did it at school, the line has no width and the surface has no depth. So if I can just relate this to Plato's notion of distinct being, right, because I can come back to the solid here. So he would say that justice has a being in that justice is itself and not itself, or goodness has a being in that it's itself and not itself. And this was a very important thing in his answer to Parmenides in the Sophist, where he says actually non-being exists as the otherness of being. So if we go to a solid and we've made a solid distinct, it's distinct by the limit of its surface, which is not it in itself, but in its otherness. It's actually the limit of its otherness. It's in its non-being or otherness that limits its being as the solid. So that's how in Platonism and generally in Plato's notion of the other being in the same, being part of the same, because you can't have the same without the other. In this way, in geometry, it's actually the limit of the otherness of the being of the thing.
Yes, you'll be unsurprised maybe to hear that. That was a fantastic summary of the Platonist position. But I think that's one version of the very thing that I'm trying to move away from, for a variety of reasons. When you were talking about, that kind of like double movement from the point to the solid and back again, I was reminded of Hegel's line about Spinoza, a triangle doesn't rotate itself. And by that, I just mean to say that the kind of genetic processes that you're describing when you speak about geometry in this way seem to me to be abstract in a way that removes the question of the surface from its reality. And what I would like to do, and this comes back to the start of your question, I'm certain this is going to disappoint you. What I would like to do is to think the surface without reference to the solid whatsoever. That's probably part of the reason why I had trouble talking about the point and the line vis-a-vis the surface as well. And it does seem to me that, like we can talk about Euclid's notion, but the kind of geometry of surfaces that we get in Gauss and Riemann is very different from any of the kind of linear productive models that we see in this kind of, as they call them, Platonic solids, right, in mathematics, the genesis of these in geometric fashion. So my answer, yeah, it's very disappointing to you. I would say that I'm searching for a way to think about surfaces in a way that does not fit at all within that Platonist framework. And I'm afraid 2,500 words is not enough to really get to all these things. But I thank you very much for that summary, though. It's immensely clarifying for me. Thank you.
So maybe we can return to the eagle's lair. Are there any sort of intra-panel questions up here before we...
I mean, I do have one, yeah. To touch on this topic of analogy. I hate analogy. I think it's one of the most... It's a pox on philosophical thinking for a variety of reasons. I'm interested in what you think where the desire for analogy, how to explain the desire for analogy itself.
Well, in the case that I'm talking about, I would explain it as a consequence of the difficulty that people have in perceiving the way in which they're entangled with technical objects from the outset. Stiegler's kind of a logo was a flying fish. And the reason is that Aristotle talked about three kinds of souls. The sensory soul, but no, the nutritive soul, the vegetative soul, which is like a plant. The soul is for Aristotle, a being that has the principle of its movement in itself, unlike a rock. You can move a rock, but it doesn't move by itself. So a plant which grows, but which basically doesn't have any senses. An animal soul that senses its environment and therefore can also interact with the environment. And the noetic soul, which is the human soul, the soul that thinks. And for the animal soul, the sensory soul, it's always in a milieu. It's always in its proper environment. So sight has its proper milieu. And this is important because Stiegler says, well, so we can say, for example, that for a fish, its milieu is water. And that the thing that defines what a fish's environment is more than anything else is water. But what a fish has the most difficulty perceiving is water. But Aristotle didn't say, for the noetic soul, what is its milieu? And when Stiegler got to prison, this was one of the questions that really animated his thinking. And at first he thought language, as many philosophers have thought. We are the being that speaks. But how old is speaking? Not that old. Is that really what makes us? And he decides, no, it's not. It's the fact that we externalize ourselves in general, in artifacts. which long predates speech and predates Homo sapiens. But that this is the thing that's hardest for us to perceive. And you can say, well, how can it be hard to perceive? We know it all the time. And look, I'm not willing to have my phone further away than that. So I've got paper, you've got paper. We know that we're surrounded by this curtain of objects, and especially of memory objects, that this is how. So what do you mean that we don't know it? We don't know it, that how much that it is in us as what makes us. We don't know it as the intimate character of our whole existence. We think, oh yeah, one human being, another human being, he thinks his thoughts, she thinks her thoughts. No, that's not where the thoughts happen. Well, thoughts don't happen in your brain. They happen between the brain and the piece of paper. They happen between the brain and the piece of paper and me and him and her and us. Thinking is hard to say where it is, but it's not just in here. And it's not just in here because it's not that this is an analogy for my memory. It's that it is my memory. I have no memory without it. If I had never had this memory, I would not remember anything. I'd be like a fish. And the point of the flying fish, I should point out, is the flying fish can see water from above. So maybe by leaving the milieu, it perceives the milieu, even if when it goes back in the water, it's already probably forgotten it after about 3 milliseconds. But you never know. It might think, oh, water. And what Bernard is saying with that is, when he was in prison, he was outside that world, and he felt that loss. But then he felt that loss as the possibility of seeing it. And I can give you another example. There's an Iranian guy named Hossein Darakhshan, who also went to prison, and he went to prison for longer than Bernard, but he did go for political reasons. He was a dissident. And when he got out of prison, he went to the United States and he wrote an article about lots of things, including what he noticed when he got out of prison. He went to prison because of blogs, what he blogged. And what he noticed is that from when he went to prison to when he got out of prison, blogs are not what the internet is about. The internet is about Facebook. This is already probably 8-9 years ago, something like that. In other words, it's not about links. Google is about links. Facebook is not about links. It's about keeping you in the one spot and with a constant stream of infinite scrolling. Now, we've all lived the same history as this guy. We all were alive before blogs, or at least I was. Before blogs, then blogs. In other words, Google, then Facebook, and now whatever, ChatGPT. But do we perceive what it means for the difference between who we were 10 years before and who we were 10 years later? No, we don't. We really struggle to perceive it. But if you're in prison and you get out, you perceive it. In other words, those analogies are a product of a very old thought that doesn't perceive those changes and sees the human being as simply the organism that you see, and whatever else you can make and it's very easy to make analogies with those things. The entanglement of them it requires you to be like a flying fish, and it's not easy, and it's impossible thousands of years ago. But now it's possible because the change is so rapid that if you're removed from it or you find some other mechanism, but if you're constantly in that flow, in that stream, then you just don't perceive the milieu that is redefining you constantly. No doubt there's other reasons too.
Okay, Matt, just while you're gesturing, I've been trying to think of a way I can make the two of you not fight exactly. That would be that would be crap for the mere amusement of the audience. But I was thinking when Daniel was talking about discipline, that I suspect that you have a broad agreement on that kind of question, and especially in terms of maybe something, think of Deleuze's postscripts on societal control, which you alluded to, Daniel, where, what takes the place of discipline is allows you to say, let's throw off all of those, former repressive apparatuses, but still for what the replacement is control, which operates on a kind of freedom but nonetheless canalizes you, channels desire in certain ways and so forth. But anyway, looking for a possible disagreement between you in this space, and this may not be true, but Deleuze, as far as I understand, and Stiegler are both influenced by Simondon on the question of individuation. A lot of what you've been talking about, Daniel, seems to me is about, with pharmacology and so forth, is about pathologies or things that interrupt the process of individuation via both, as you said, both collective individuation and individual individuation. But I'm wondering whether, you might not think this is true, Daniel, whether Stiegler's version of individuation, I sometimes get the sense that there's a Aristotelian residue around basically a concept of potentiality there. And I don't know whether that's true, but just thinking about kind of Deleuzean oppositions to the category of the possible, I was wondering, I suppose I'll consolidate the question like this. How each of you sees individuation coming from Simondon, and whether, to what extent you agree with each other on this.
You want to go first?
Obviously, individuation, the production of individual things, is crucial for Deleuze, notably in Difference and Repetition and in 1,000 Plateaus, where you can see how much of Simondon he's taken. In 1,000 Plateaus is very clear the way that the strata are set up and the processes that are involved, 100%. Deleuze's hostility to the category of possibility is taken from his Bergsonian commitments, right? That when we say it's possible that, I didn't come here today, this is something that I produce in the moment of thinking about it, this possible state didn't pre-exist. It wasn't latent, as if there was an infinite number of possible states of the world, one of them waiting to be chosen. There are all kinds of problems that attend an attempt to explain why one would be chosen rather than another, how it would be realized, all those things. Unfortunately, Bryan, though, I'm going to scupper the premise of your question and say that Deleuze very much has a concept of potential, but a sort of a completely static one, which he identifies with the virtual.
Yes, yes.
This is super inside baseball, and I don't know how interesting it is, but in general terms, he wants to rob potential of the Aristotelian kind of character of the idea and simply say that in order for things to be different than what they are, there has to be a problem that's encountered, as you pointed out. These problems are real, they have a being, and that's what potential really means, the insistence of a problem. Now, I don't know if that's what you would how you would characterize potentiality in Stiegler.
I talked about Aristotle and three souls, and in fact, the way that he gets to Aristotle is through Hegel, and through Hegel's reading of Aristotle, specifically in terms of the in itself and the for its. In other words, the potential and the actuality of those souls. In other words, what does that mean? It means that the sensitive soul, which is the animal, most of the time is not really being fully an animal. A lion can be really an animal, but 3/4 of the time he's just asleep. And most of the time we're not being noetic souls either. We're That's why we have the potential to regret. We don't actualize our potential. In fact, we can only actualize it intermittently, briefly. Because if we could really be noetic all the time, then we would be like the gods. But we're not. And this is actually fundamental to Stiglitz' thought, I think, which is a thought of tendencies and counter-tendencies, which again comes from Simondon, but which Stiglitz puts in a very straightforward way. There is no tendency that does not have a counter-tendency in this philosophy. And if to grow as a plant even is the tendency of that kind of soul, it's against the tendency that nevertheless also inhabits it to die. In other words, to succumb to entropy. And for us, that counter-tendency can take all kinds of forms. For us, the noetic soul. We can die long before we're dead. Now, this is what I meant when I said, if you're not attempting to rise, and if you're not rising, you're already falling back. To stay in one place is already to be going back, because you are the play of these tendencies and counter-tendencies that are irreducible. And we can understand what that means very easily in terms of physics. It's a question of probabilities. It takes energy to stop the advance of those probabilities of our existence. In other words, you can build a sandcastle. I'm making an analogy.
I noticed that, yeah.
You can make a sandcastle, right? And it's improbable. But when the wind and the waves come back, it's highly probable it's going to get washed away. It might develop 3 more stories, but it's not going to, because those probabilities are overwhelming. This is what is the second law of thermodynamics. So if we can say that life is a negentropic process, we're right. But that doesn't mean it's not an entropic process. All of the metabolic processes that we go through, all the food we eat, all of the shit we produce, that's producing more entropy. It's accelerating entropy. But it's accelerating it in the production of the maintenance of our organization for as long as we live. And what I'm saying about technical life, about AI, is that there's another kind of probability process that's occurring. And it's one that Nietzsche recognized 100 years ago, the reduction to averages. More than 100 years ago. The reduction to averages. All of those algorithmic technologies are probabilistic. They work on nothing but probabilities. In other words, they work to eliminate the improbable. We cannot get rid of that. The question is whether the probable can make possible the improbable. Like life is a question of an improbable event on this planet that's been going for 3.7 billion years, something like that. So, if we accept all of that, then we have a way of understanding what individuation means. Individuation, if you take the idea that individuation means, in Simondon, you don't start from the individual as a state. What I was saying before, the analogies come because you say, here is the individual Matt, and there is his phone. That's not how you should start. You should start from processes of individuation. The individual is what arises from that process, and it's never finished. And why is it never finished? Because you never finish the struggle against entropy. You never finish the struggle against being reduced to the probable, whether it's physical or informational. That's why we are singular beings, because even though we're never finished, we are the unfolding of a process. And what does that mean? It means that we are the unfolding of one history. And that history is a projection, then makes possible a projection of the continuation of that history. So, to me, it's important to know that means we're not reducing individuation to biology, we're not reducing life to biology. The informational process is another systemic element that's introduced, just like life is a systemic element that's introduced, or the nervous system. But what it means is individuation is never just your individuation. What am I doing when I talk to you now? I'm individuating myself in you. I'm sending you words that you hear differently than I understand them myself. And you hear them all differently from each other because you are the products of different histories than my own and than each other's. And because you hear it differently, you interpret it differently, you produce different results. You live differently. But why do I say it to you? Because I believe I have something to say to you that you haven't heard before. And why do you listen? Because you hope that that's true as well. In other words, together we try to create a future where we're towards an understanding. Maybe we fail. Definitely we fail. But the point is that understanding is never finished either. If we're talking about a reduction to probabilities, if we're talking about marketing, then what we're talking about is a probabilistic process that makes your history more similar to mine, and therefore makes the chances of you interpreting what I say differently from each other lower than it would have been in a time where that probabilistic process wasn't working so well on you. Only because we have different histories can we interpret differently. In other words, the whole meaning of Stiglitz philosophy is how do we save individuation, the individuation of me, the individuation of you, and the individuation of us together as we try to be in a meeting, be a country, be a tribe, be a group or a company or whatever, or a university. The question of whether AI can be beneficial is the question of whether it can promote individuation or not. In other words, whether it can actualize those potentials that are not just in me, but are in between us.
Do you guys think we can maybe take maybe one or two questions from the floor and then maybe have some final remarks? Does that seem reasonable, guys?
Sure.
Do we have any questions?
This question's directed to Jon, and when I walked in, you were talking about a sort of transubstantiation, and I thought, wow, this is deep, and it's interesting because you said you don't like analogies, but what you were talking about with Descartes and that process of transubstantiation is sort of analogous, because you sort of have the surface, which is the bread and the wine, which is a thingliness, and then you have this nothingness on the other side, and it's a bit of a burst when that process happens. I think that connects nothingness and thingliness. It's like a mediating third, which I kind of see as an analogical thinking. So.
Absolutely, yeah. To be clear, I don't think Descartes' account of transubstantiation is at all viable, even on its own terms.
Yeah.
It involves some very strange views. And in fact, like the history of early modern philosophy's attempts to explain this situation are crazy. There's just this sequence of super bizarre metaphysical explanations for what's involved. That would be a fun book to read, all of those explanations, one after the other. I agree that Descartes' forms of argumentation are infested with analogical reasoning, much, much more profoundly than he would recognize as well. So, completely agree. And the goal would be to somehow, from my point of view, extract a theory of surfaces from analogical reasoning in general, to stop thinking about it as if it was like something else. But to me, that's the premise of all philosophical thought. Yeah. Things are not like each other. They are to be thought on their own terms. That's philosophy for me.
Got you. Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe we should start to wrap it up. So do you guys want to just conclude up there?
After you.
Maybe I just want to say to you that that Stigler himself, whom I love, was in a way para-academic himself. Yes, he worked at a university, but he's not like all those other guys. He worked 1 day a week at a university outside of Paris. Why? Because he did not want to just be an academic. And what did he teach? And who did he teach in that university? He taught engineering students. It was a technology university. Those are the people that he wanted to teach philosophy to, because these are the questions that he felt these were the problems that needed to be turned into questions, and those questions are not just theoretical questions. They're practical questions, they're instrumental questions, and they're economic questions. We talked about value before. What is value? Value is a way that you make a selection. Biological life makes selections through mutation and through genetic selection. We make selections in other ways. We make behavioral selections by attaching values to things. Where do those values come from? They come, in the end, not just from the individual or the collective, but from, like the geometric point, things that we believe in that tell us what to do. So an example that you could give, a very obvious one, is justice. Justice is exactly like the geometric point. It doesn't exist. Nobody has ever seen it on Earth. But it doesn't mean that we should give it up. It means that it's an idea that we try to believe in order to figure out how to avoid injustice, whether by making laws or some other way. What this means is economics is fundamentally a question of where the value of values can be believed in. What value of values do we want to believe in? And this is our question today, but we have to see it as an economic question. It's a Nietzschean question. He's the one who told us we're living in the devaluation of all values. But it's an economic question too. How do we choose the value of values? Is this some kind of free choice? Well, Stigler is saying, yes, we can only individuate. Individuate means we don't know how we'll individuate tomorrow. But today we can. And we can say that what matters is what I said, what promotes individuation, or to put it another way, what promotes the struggle against entropy, not just biologically or in terms of the biosphere, because there's a destruction of the memory, the genetic memory of the species when you have extinctions. It's a destruction of memory. But there's also the destruction of memory that produces the diversity of individuation processes from which rich futures become possible. To say it's an economic question for Stigler means we cannot know the future, the utopian economic plan to believe in. But we are in an urgent situation, but in that urgent situation, we must conduct economic experiments. In other words, identify that value and organize programs around them that then we try to say we can reorganize our whole economies on this. This is the dream of Stiegler. And you can say it's a dream that can never become possible. It's possible. It's probable. Very probable. He knew it's probably never going to become possible. And he killed himself. But what I'm saying to you is, it's not enough to just talk. It's not enough to just be an academic. What matters is how to translate. And it's not enough to resist. Resistance is useless. What matters is to invent, and to invent by instituting experiments that are based on encouraging selections that promote individuation rather than destroy it or undermine it. And this is what Nietzsche saw coming, this destruction. And it's what Heidegger talked about in terms of saying that what Nietzsche saw was not just a question of destruction, but of devastation. What's the difference between destruction and devastation? Destruction destroys what's been built. Devastation destroys the conditions of building anything else or growing anything else. The desert grows, is what Nietzsche said. In other words, the danger of AI is that it will be the final step in this process that destroys the conditions of growing something new, because it ultimately breaks the individuation processes that we have to hope to remain. And this is the kind of work that Stiegler really cared about doing, creating these kinds of experiments. That'll do.
I was reminded by something that you both said of how important anxiety is in collective individuation in Simondon. And I guess I want to say thank you, Matt, again, and everyone who organised this. The MSCP didn't start without anxiety, and it also just happened because people decided that they were going to do it. That's it. So, I embrace this point. Any one of you could do this same thing, right? We asked, just sitting up here with microphones and all of that, and I did just give this super metaphysical little paper and all of that, and we talked about a variety of topics, but if you want something like this to happen, just do it. That's my advice. Thank you for coming. And thank you.
Thank you, Jon.